So the first genuinely urban societies in the world formed alongside just a few major rivers in these subtropical areas spanning all the way from Egypt to the Middle East to India in these kind of three pockets of civilization. So we're going to talk about the rise of urban societies in the Middle East, in Mesopotamia first, as the kind of first third of this class. So, during the period from the 4000s to the really 2000s BC, the muddy kind of subtropical region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers saw the emergence of a significant number of cities. The rise of urbanism was very early and very fast during this period, and really by 3000 BC, an astonishing 80% of the population in this area had transitioned entirely to urban living. Constructing canals and irrigation systems to control rivers, greatly contributed to, the consolidation of Mesopotamian cities. And, as you can imagine, as we went over in the last class, mud, specifically unbaked mud, emerged as the predominant construction material, right? Adobe bricks employed in both architecture and, surprisingly, in writing, right? So buildings were constructed primarily using mud bricks, unbaked mud bricks, and information was usually always recorded on mud or clay tablets. These mud or clay tablets contained the earliest known writing, which was Sumerian, often used for, recording the population's surplus crops, recording their, appropriate taxation and their redistribution. And this script is called cuneiform. You might have heard of it. It is the earliest form of human writing that we have evidence for. And so, the emergence of urban settlements in Mesopotamia, in this region we call Mesopotamia, traces back to around 5000 BC, particularly in the kind of southern delta region known as Sumer. And I'll put arrows on these slides to kind of direct your eyes to what I'm talking about when I want to talk about a specific part of a specific image, because I don't have a laser pointer, because I'm not, here in person. So, do be watching carefully. Don't just be listening to these lectures. Do be watching for these arrows, and hopefully you understand what I'm talking about with this. But other agricultural towns, not just Sumer, along the Euphrates, also evolved into substantial city-states a little bit later. And each city, it seems, built essentially a double set of walls with at least one, towering temple at the center of the city, at the center of its, surrounding agricultural estates. But these, city-states were independent. They weren't, at this time, part of, a greater kingdom, a greater nation. Each city-state is what it sounds like, a city-state, a state ruled by a city. So the ruling elite of Sumer, this first city, consisted of, surprisingly, not kings, but high priests who managed the temple and kind of controlled the irrigation networks from the river in the surrounding areas, and then taxed the farmers for redistribution for specialist workers. So not everyone had to be a farmer, but the taxation and redistribution to workers was done by the priests. This very, ingenious, it sounds very normal today, but at this time, innovative form of running the society. So you can have very specialist workers, so you can have progress in your society. So in the first cities in Sumer, the priests were, as I said, the ruling class, and their temple essentially owned all the town's cows and sheep in pens, and stored everyone's harvest in silos around the temple, and then distributed it back out evenly to the community, right? So the farmers didn't just get the greatest share, everyone got an even share of the surplus, of the produce of the lands. And so thanks to this method, you could be something other than a shepherd or farmer and be reasonably sure that you'd eat. This was called theocratic socialism. At least this is what we call it today. The priests in these cities had all the power because they were able to communicate directly with the sort of moody gods of the Sumerian religion and influence things like the Tigris and Euphrates unpredictable flooding, or at least this is what people believed, right? So given that the region tends to kind of yo-yo capriciously between, devastating flood and horrible drought, this is very characteristic of Mesopotamia at the time. Very much unlike the Nile, the very predictable, very easy to farm Nile in Egypt. The Tigris and Euphrates are very unpredictable rivers, which is why they dig these canals out of them, because they don't flood regularly, and they have to irrigate their crops. But as I say, given that the region kind of tends to yo-yo capriciously between devastating flood and horrible drought, it follows that one would believe that these Mesopotamian gods, that these Sumerian gods, were kind of random and capricious, and that any priests who might be able to, lead rituals that might be able to placate these gods would be very useful individuals indeed. So, obviously, people living back at the beginning of civilization in Mesopotamia, they didn't believe that the rivers flooded and dried up because of some predictable science. They believed it was directly influenced by their relationship with their gods. So if they were placating their gods, they would have regular floods, but if they weren't satisfying their gods, they would have frequent horrible droughts. And it was up to the priests to communicate and satisfy these gods for the rest of the people, right? So this is why the priests ruled. The priests influenced the gods, who influenced the flooding and droughts of the rivers. So the temples, as I mentioned, at the center of these Sumerian cities were called ziggurats. These were essentially stepped, kind of pyramidal temples rising on one or more platforms. These ziggurats were always constructed with the intention of getting high enough to influence the sky gods, the gods that controlled rain. So you needed something very elevated, the most towering thing in the town, to be able to influence the sky gods. So Uruk's White Temple here was the earliest known true ziggurat. It emerged kind of as a hub of religion and governance in Uruk. So, cuneiform tablets were actually unearthed in Uruk that reveal the populace's dedication to a specific sky god named Anu. And that this temple was constructed around 3400 to 3000 BC, and this temple kind of underwent successive transformations with new layers built over earlier ones. So the temple's base, we can tell, rose to about 13 meters and adorned with these regularly spaced grooves, and then an access stair and ramp were carved through the eastern mass of the structure. And at the pinnacle, as you can imagine, the highest point, this kind of sanctuary stood in the form of a rectangular box enhanced with, decorative protruding buttresses and niches. And priests actually entered the interior hall from the southwestern side, from the back side, while a special door to the north was reserved for Anu's appearances, for Anu appearing to the worshippers, likely via a wooden statue, right? This is a statue that they believed the sky god would possess and communicate to the priests through. And so in the very middle of this temple, it would largely be an open space, but it would have this sacrificial altar, symbolically offering sustenance to the god in the form of usually prepared meals or slaughtered goats and sheep. And this is what the priests were largely responsible for, bringing prepared meals for the god to ritually eat, to kind of satisfy him, and ensure good harvest, ensure good weather for good harvests, ensure the river floods enough for proper agriculture, right? And so Uruk's White Temple was actually also coated in gypsum plaster and whitewashed, and you can imagine this would have projected a very luminous appearance. This temple would have essentially glowed. You can imagine this gleaming facade would have stood out as this bright, visible landscape even from neighboring cities. But the majority of it today has obviously melted away because of its perishable adobe construction, and now it kind of remains in the landscape as this kind of amorphous blob. But we can tell from records and from the archaeology a reliable sense of what it used to look like in order to kind of produce this reconstruction. Also, there's other ziggurats that survive much better for us to look at and inform ourselves of. the White Temple of Uruk. Another famous ziggurat was the Oval Temple of Khafage, begun around 2650 BC. And the temple's entrance actually featured a formal gate accompanied by these guard towers, so very protected, very sacred to its inhabitants. This threshold of the wall and the guard towers marked the transition in the city from the profane world of the city streets to the temple precinct. The entry court here, once you got past the guard towers, actually served as the public zone for temple administrators. The governors of the city essentially calculated taxes here. And then, passing through this second set of higher oval walls led to the inner court, accessible via a ramp just like the White Temple of Uruk. And then in this inner court, it seems circular basins within the court kind of awaited pilgrims for purification rituals, so they would have had to ritually wash themselves before offering anything to this sky god. So in this temple, the populace could actually participate in placating the god, and so the court's perimeter had a lot of storage rooms for food items and for livestock that people would bring to placate their god, and it also had workshops and bakeries to accommodate pilgrims who were visiting this temple, who would have visited all around, so from the farms of the city-state, from the city, and then priests would have brought these food sacrifices to the temple, which they actually say they rubbed on the statue's mouth, and then the rest of the food was then distributed to the celebrants, probably to the rest of the priest class, to be eaten after this very ritualistic act, placating their god. From the 3000s BC to around 2500 BC, the climate, however, begins to slowly change. Droughts and climate change occur, and Sumerian city populations begin to dwindle through starvation and warfare. Local kings take weaker cities, and foreign conquerors from the steppes began to ride in and mop up Sumeria, ruling during this period of intense strife. The title King of Kish appeared around 2500 BC, signifying a king's authority over multiple cities in the region of Kish, essentially what locals called the region of Mesopotamia at the time. So here, military leaders replaced the governing authority, the priestly governing authority, of the earlier priesthoods. The responsibility for the well-being of the land then was shifted from gods to kings. These kings took on, though, a quasi-religious role. How, you ask? They engaged in sacred marriage or sacred consummation, often with the high priestess of the city's temple within the temple, to ensure that their offspring would be considered divine, half-breeds of the gods. The most important political shift and the restoration of order in Mesopotamia came around 2500 BC, when a foreign courtier, Sargon the Great, seized power from the reigning king of Kish and proceeded to take control of as many as 65 cities, more than any king of Kish had controlled before. He ruled for an astonishing half a century, and so Sargon amassed really the region's first empire, uniting the areas of Syria and Armenia with the old city-states of the Sumerian Delta. Sargon, essentially established a very strong hereditary dynasty from this new capital city that he built called Akkad, hence his name, Sargon of Akkad. So Sargon's successors in his Akkadian dynasty essentially took the titles of kings of the four quarters of the earth and required the same forms of addresses allotted to the gods, establishing this tradition of deified rulers. So the transition from this kind of system of loosely connected city-states to the post-Sumerian empire building of the Akkadians led to the development of essentially the royal palace, kind of replacing the importance of the stepped ziggurats, though they still survived during this period. So, during the decline of Sumeria and the rise of Sargon's conquest, the palace emerged as, a rival structure to the temples of the many Mesopotamian cities. And written documents at the time actually tell us that Sargon built a palace at Akkad capable of feeding 5,400 courtiers. It must have been absolutely enormous, but sadly it does not survive. Its bricks were probably used to construct other buildings after the fall of his dynasty. At Mari in northern Syria, though, a great palace from this era does somewhat survive today and to be archaeologically excavated. It was partially destroyed during the time of Sargon and again in 1759 BC by the Babylonians, but they lit it on fire, and the torching of the palace actually converted the mud brick walls and cuneiform tablets stored inside into terracotta, preserving the foundations of the palace beautifully and preserving, the written documents within very well. So the Palace of Mar essentially served as both a royal residence and a religious center. As you would expect with the godlike worship of the rulers at this period, the temple and the royal palace were kind of joined into one establishment at the city center because the local king was the city priest. And this palace was essentially divided into two halves, each structured around a great court. So right now we're going to go over the purpose of these two halves of the palace and the purpose of the palace in general. So let's talk about the twisting entrance into the palace before we even get into the structure of the palace itself. So the architect who built the palace went to very great trouble to make the approach through the fortified entry gate at the northwest corner a twisting series of 3 antechambers to slow down entrance and allow guards to better control their access, so people couldn't rush the king, so assassins essentially couldn't rush the king, so dignified uniformed lions could come up to petition the king, kind of like as you would imagine, maybe the rides at Disney World, how they kind of snake back and forth between twisting passages and ropes to kind of control and spread out the line in these kind of small spaces, right? So the eastern half of the palace, which this twisting entrance led to, I'm sure you can imagine, served as the site for public encounters and ceremonies at the palace temple. So, this great court, you can imagine, would have accommodated hundreds of courtiers and public commissioners. The hall at the southern end of the court, which you see here I've indicated, may have probably served as the primary audience chamber and the throne room where the king sat and answered petitions. It was approached by this very special set of semicircular steps, as well as, very clearly carried fresco paintings, mostly lost now, but we know which had kind of a clear base of red. But then the palace temple, the oldest part of the site, occupied this remote southeast corner. The inclusion of temple-like spaces in the palace, as I've said, suggests the ruler carried out the priestly functions himself and commanded a quasi-divine status. But again, the temple is kind of pushed off to the side, whereas the palace gets center stage here. Architecture always very clearly reflects the cultural consciousness of societies at the time, and so religion is taking a back seat to ruler worship here, and this is very clear in the architecture, right? And then this palace's second courtyard in the western half of the Mari Palace served exclusively the ruler and his private retinue, so his bodyguards and his private courtiers, his family, friends of his family, friends of his, people with official administration positions in the city-state, right? While this is parallel to the first court, there was really no direct access between the two. You kind of had to be cued in by the elites to get to this second court, where the king would have spent most of his time, planning things with his administration. The scribes actually used this kind of hollow chamber between the two courts as the palace archives, leaving behind for posterity, for archaeologists to find in the modern day, a stash of around 20,000 cuneiform tablets. So it really tells us the way this palace functioned. Remarkable fresco paintings actually survived around the second court, which you can see here. One fresco actually depicts the king of Mari receiving a rod and ring from the goddess Ishtar, one of the Mesopotamian gods. And these paintings actually set up one's approach to the throne room. So at the west end of this western throne room, a raised platform kind of served again as the platform for the throne, while at the east end, this kind of special niche contained statues of actually two goddesses holding vases from which water flowed into a drain, representing, this perennial concern for water supply, but infinite in the presence of this deified king. And then obviously, the king and his family would have lived in this palace, and the private living quarters of the royal family, plus a sizable harem, were gathered around this kind of smallest court in the northwestern section of the palace. And this is where the king's family and his harem would have spent their day-to-day. And then the western flank essentially housed a service wing with kitchens and baths, one of them with 2 terracotta tubs and a hole in the floor for a toilet. So, very lavish compared to the rest of the city. And the very, kind of labyrinthine plan of the palace at Mari allowed the paths of servants and troops to be segregated from that of the king, so the king wouldn't have to cross paths with servants or with troops. Everyone had their own hallways, their own way about going throughout this palace. It ensured that the king's intimate life with his queen and it said 40 concubines in the western half would remain absolutely independent from his duties and public display in the eastern half, right? And the king's royal harem, the king's, prototypical royal harem, also guaranteed, as you can imagine, that the woman would give birth to only the king's children. But it's important that we talk about the most famous Mesopotamian city, and this is the city of Ur. You can see this beautiful reconstruction right here. And the city of Ur became essentially the largest Bronze Age city in Mesopotamia after the fall of Sargon's Akkadian dynasty, his Akkadian empire. And Ur's walls were essentially this massive oval walls which enclosed this complex network of very narrow, unpaved streets between these courtyard houses, right? The city featured a port at its western edge, a significant palace in the north, kind of central of the city, and a central great ziggurat carried over from the ancient times. Street widths were never really greater than 3 meters, relieved only by small squares within the cities, and these are very common for early cities around the entire earth. Early urban societies around the entire earth, they really didn't know how, they really hadn't figured out city management or even sewage in most places yet, especially in Mesopotamia. Very narrow streets, very chaotic streets, not like the grid line streets we have in America, in Omaha. Very chaotic streets, very narrow streets are very common in early cities, especially in Mesopotamia. And so the houses of Ur, as you can imagine, formed these very tightly packed blocks built with shared walls. And since the residents, regularly dumped their refuse into the public space, their sewage into the public space, into the streets just outside the front door, as I mentioned, there's no sewage. The level of the street continually rose as the sewage dried up and rose to street level. So actually, funnily enough, the thresholds of Ur's houses had to be constantly adjusted upward to keep pace with the rising street level. So this was a city slowly rising into the sky. And this is the same with almost every single Mesopotamian city that we have found archaeologically. And so after a few generations, you can imagine the inner steps on the front door actually descended to the house's original floor level. So the first floor level over after multiple generations of living in these houses would actually look like a basement. And so Ur's houses were mostly these kind of single-story structures of mud brick with several rooms wrapped around an open court, and you can see a nice kind of blueprint of this in the bottom picture here. They usually had very little or to no exterior windows because the street kind of doubled as this above ground sewer. You wouldn't want these fumes propagating in through your windows, so you would have usually lit most of the interior with oil lamps or candles or rushlights. The wealthier houses in Ur, though, would have been whitewashed inside and out, kind of providing a little bit more protection, a little bit more cleanliness. But typically, almost every house in these cities had servants or slaves who used the ground floor for their cooking, for their washing, while the nuclear family lived upstairs, away from the refuse, away from the sewage of the streets. And this type of house, which is actually still being built in this region in some cases, inspired, as you can imagine, the courtyard houses of the Greeks and the Romans, which we're going to talk about a little bit later in a couple classes. The Great Ziggurat, or at the western end of the city, is the most famous Mesopotamian ziggurat there is, and unlike most Mesopotamian temples that have disappeared because of their adobe construction, right, their unbaked brick construction, this one has survived because it was covered by a layer of baked bricks with bitumen mortar and actually stamped with the cuneiform phrase built by Ur-Nammu, king of Ur. And then mud bricks filled the core of the ziggurat. And then with preservation in mind, the builders actually cut these narrow slits, which you might be able to see on this picture. They're called weep holes at regular intervals through the baked brick casing to sort of drain the interior of residual moisture over time and prevent the walls from deforming. The triple staircases on this massive pyramidal ziggurat converged at this gateway temple at this top. And the temple of the god Nana, which served as this moon god's chamber, rested at the top of the third palace, plastered in, we think, blue. And this is where the sacred consummation between the high priestess and the king would have taken place, as well as their feeding of the god. And then around the perimeter of the walls surrounding the ziggurat were actually kitchens for preparing the sacrifices to Nana. And then south of the ziggurat, very interestingly, beyond its courtyard stood this perfectly square palace, not for the king, but for the high priestesses, whose role in the court of the moon god was essentially the survival of the community. One among them, as I've said, was selected each year to consummate a physical union with the god, a part probably acted by the king at the top of the ziggurat. And it was thought that this, ritual copulation was to ensure the fertility of the land. And so next to their palace, the king, used a similarly scaled palace just for religious occasions, with his actual palace being further to the east. You can tell from its two courtyard plan, it's very similar to the palace at Mari in its layout. So the very stark architectural and spiritual power embodied by Ur-Nammu's ziggurat endured long after his dynasty's decline. The succeeding conquerors of the region dutifully maintained the great ziggurat and eagerly copied it in other cities. And so, to conclude our discussion of Mesopotamian architecture, in this world full of dreadful uncertainties, full of threats of war, famine, and ecological catastrophe, this being a very regular thing in Mesopotamia, the Mesopotamian ziggurat transmitted kind of the comforting illusion that humans could influence the gods for the good of their city. So, series of pharaohs. So, the period of Old Kingdom Egypt really overlaps with the time of the Sumerian city-states. It goes back all the way to the beginning of cities in Sumeria, albeit maybe just a little bit later, starting around 2700 BC. And their cities in this Old Kingdom, the cities of the Old Kingdom are mostly gone, but they built these huge, as lasting burial structures that endure as the most permanent constructions on Earth. The great expanse of the pyramids, suggests that the needs of the afterlife in Old Kingdom Egypt far exceeded the needs of here and now. And so, just like the capricious Tigris and Euphrates shaped the worldview of the Mesopotamians, the Nile very heavily, shaped the worldview of the Egyptians. And so each summer, the Nile very dependably flooded its fields at precisely the right time, leaving behind a deposit of rich black silt. And this, already, I'm sure you are being able to tell, sounds very, very different from the world of the Mesopotamians. Planting was so easy that the Egyptians were said to just toss seeds on the silty earth after the Nile had flooded and let their cattle kind of walk on it to press seeds into the ground, and then grain and figs and wheats and pomegranates and melons sprouted up. It was this absolute paradise, according to them. And so the Egyptians could really create these big food surpluses with very little work, allowing time and energy for the impressive projects like the pyramids. And so, while ancient Sumerian religion saw the afterlife as this gloomy, dark place, Egyptians were often buried with things that were very useful and pleasurable to them in life, because the afterlife to them was seen as a continuation of this life. Only you can communicate with your old world. The deceased can communicate with the world of the living, right? So the Egyptian worldview and religion is a lot more optimistic than that of the Sumerians, because the Nile floods so dependably, because their lives are made a lot easier through their ease of growing food, right? And although I said not a lot of their domestic structures survive, not a lot of their houses and palaces survive, enough survive to tell us that, aside from mud-walled structures covered in palm trunk roofs, a lot like those houses you see in Mesopotamia, the most frequent house type actually used reeds and papyrus stems, either bundled together or kind of matted into these planes and stretched between wooden posts. Tent-like structures were actually a lot more common in ancient Egypt than is depicted in Hollywood, especially in the south of Egypt. It said even the royal palace was a massive tent-like structure during the Old Kingdom period. So in the early 3000s BC, a centralized state emerged with a kind of deified monarch unifying the regions of Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt. So the king, later known by the Greek word pharaoh, was thought of as a sort of junior god and was in charge of speaking to the gods and placating them on Egypt's behalf, just like the Mesopotamian kings. He was the only one who could actually enter temples in the Old Kingdom outside of the priesthoods who simply upkept them. The pharaoh was essentially the priest king in charge of keeping order of Egypt in terms of law, infrastructure, defense, trade, and an agricultural fortune. Since pharaohs became gods on their death, it made sense to please them, hence the idea of building massive pyramids. These were, investments to ensure good terms with the pharaoh, who became gods and rewarded Egypt with the gift of the Nile in the form of annual summer floods. So during the 2000s BC, the pharaohs and their courtiers erected hundreds of colossal funerary monuments, including over 90 pyramids. All Egyptians, of course, had to bury their dead, though, and initially they did so in the form called a mastaba, which is just the Arabic word for bench for both pharaohs and, all upper-class citizens. This was always done on the west side of the Nile. The Egyptians spoke of death as going west, like the setting sun, and the Nile's west bank also had this spectacularly flat and stony plateau of bedrock that could support mastabas and later pyramids a lot better than the shifty east bank. And so the mastaba essentially continued as a typical tomb form throughout the Old Kingdom period, although the pharaohs will later move on to pyramids and more complicated funerary complexes later on. But the tombs for them usually had these kind of 5-meter high mud brick perimeters filled with sand, with the burial chambers underground. And they're all meant to kind of look like a home. These were generally for individual or family burials. The Egyptians were very famous for their ancestor worship, so mastabas were, in a sense, personal family temples where you could go and you could communicate with your dead relatives. When you enter into a mastaba, usually these very cramped, these very small entry spaces compared to the size, just how big they are, you're facing essentially an offering table and a false door behind the offering table that the spirit was to, symbolically come through to enter the chapel and interact with the family. Although you can't hear them, although they can't speak, they can hear you, right? To the side of the chapel there was also typically a window, and behind this window an extra room containing what's called a ka statue, and this is essentially the statue that the soul of the deceased can possess. So if there's something that happens to the mummified body, or the body decays, the soul can always possess the statue and continue to interact with the family. It's also there as a symbol of the deceased. It looks like them, so you've entered the correct mastaba. And lastly, the most important feature of a mastaba is the air shaft that existed above the burial chamber, so the soul could get out and travel. It said up the rays of the sun to enter into the other world and also return the same way to the mastaba to communicate with their grieving family, right? So, even upper class people, even middle class people were mummified, and the mummy would often be, surrounded by grave goods with things that would help them in the afterlife. It's really common to find things like scrolls to help them, navigate getting to the afterlife. And it's also common to find some foodstuffs they might want. So, jars of wheat, jars of wine, and jars of honey. And even pharaohs were buried in, massive mastabas until King Zoser, the founder of the third dynasty of the Old Kingdom, transformed the mastabas into Egypt's first kind of pyramid. So its builder, Imhotep, the world's oldest known architect, was born as a commoner who rose to become Pharaoh Zoser's most trusted advisor and eventually his chief architect, and he invented the stepped pyramid using limestone blocks instead of mud bricks, allowing him to build even sturdier and even bigger. And so essentially what Imhotep did is he added to the traditional flat mastaba 6 levels of a stage tower. So he stacked 6 mastabas on top of one another essentially. It stood over 200 feet high, then making it the tallest building in the world, taller than even the tallest ziggurats in Mesopotamia. So its impact, as you can imagine, on the Egyptian landscape was absolutely huge, and 10 more kings actually replicated Imhotep's design of a pyramid surrounded by this kind of necropolis complex, which I'm going to go over in a minute. Their tombs became some of the biggest buildings on the planet at the time, each growing the land of the dead at Saqqara, the east bank of the Nile, until it stretched 5 miles across the desert. But on to the necropolis. The massive enclosure surrounding his complex, surrounding his pyramid, resembled the limestone walls of an Egyptian city at this time. And you can see it's even regularly spaced with towers to replicate city walls. Although there were all of these gate towers, 15 of them to be exact, only one could be entered. And I'm not going to ask that you know the intricacies of this necropolis. Your book goes into a lot more detail if you had a read of it. But essentially, the necropolis features storehouses, these kind of dummy granaries. It features these kind of fake palaces and even fake temples that would all help Zoser bring the architecture of his government entirely to the afterlife to carry on his kingly duties throughout eternity. So just like the mastabas for the middle and upper classes, where they would be buried with things they enjoyed, things they needed in their afterlife, Zoser is being buried, being entombed with things he needs to rule in the next life. This amazing effort just to set their pharaoh up for the next world. Zoser's immediate successors continued to build stepped pyramids, but the last of these was originally built by Pharaoh Huni as a stepped pyramid, but was renovated by his son and successor Snefru, who attempted to smooth out this stepped pyramid begun by his father by filling in the steps with limestone casing in order to obtain the solid pyramidal prism we know and love today. But the pitch on this first pyramidal experiment rose much too steeply to carry the loads because the limestone was built on sand, not rock, and this caused the collapse while it was still under construction, but there would be many more trials to come. Snefru went on to become pharaoh and carry out successful military campaigns in Nubia and Libya, bringing thousands of captives as slaves who were pressed into service for his progressively grandiose architectural projects, including more pyramids. And so Snefru's second effort, the bent pyramid of Dashur, proved even taller with a greater slope, now founded entirely on stone. But halfway up, cracking developed. He had gone too steep again, and so halfway up he actually changed to a lower angle, giving the pyramid its name, the bent pyramid. Snefru also created what we call the first example of a valley temple, and in this type of temple, essentially he built this colonnaded hall at the bank of the Nile, so right up against the river. That was kind of the reception area for his supposed preliminary funeral. So, they would have rituals and feasts honoring the pharaoh here. So you can imagine, the pharaoh's corpse would have arrived by boat at the Valley Temple, and here his body was washed, purified, and embalmed. And then once ready, his corpse was taken down this covered limestone passageway all the way to the pyramid, into the mortuary temple, where he was then mummified, and then he was hoisted up into the entrance of the pyramid through the passageways inside the pyramid and kind of deposited into his burial chamber, which was then sealed. And this would, prove to be the model for the great three pyramids we know today, as well as every other pyramid for every pharaoh after this point. But Snefru, believe it or not, was not even buried in the bent pyramid. Obviously a bit of a perfectionist, while he had more time to live than expected, he began to work on a third and final pyramid, and he wanted to make it absolutely perfect as he lived longer than expected. So he began his third and final work on the red pyramid, just about a mile to the north, which probably took him about 17 years. And so in this final effort, Snefru kind of adhered to this perfect 43-degree slope used on the upper part of the bent pyramid, kind of obtaining this perfect prismatic, if kind of slightly squat pyramid. And so this is where Snefru was finally buried, and it was all finished with a capstone, a single gilded limestone block crowning the structure, which doesn't survive today but is documented. And this would be the form of pyramids, the form of pyramids, gleaming with smooth and polished limestone on the outside and gilded with a gold top on the very point. So, as you can imagine, Snefru's descendants, his successors, continued to improve on this pyramid type, and his successors are the ones who built the three massive pyramids at Giza. His successor and son Khufu commissioned the first and largest pyramid at Giza, and we're going to talk about it today. So, as soon as the pharaoh Khufu ascended the throne in 2575 BC, work on his eternal resting place, his pyramid, began, and it was designed by this pharaoh's nephew, who we know his name to be Hemunu. And Hemunu essentially determined he would need 20 years to finish the royal tomb. Now, contrary to popular opinion, this pyramid was not built by slaves. Egyptians were actually regularly required to perform manual labor, some kind of manual labor for the government throughout the year as an alternative of paying taxes. And so citizens across the country came to contribute to sort of alleviate their usual taxes. So this was a very popular project, you can imagine, that ancient Egyptian citizens would work on. And so these citizens were actually housed and fed with rations, it's said, better than the average Egyptian could afford. These workers, though, averaged 10-hour days hauling limestone from 2 different quarries, and the pyramid ended up using over 2 million stones, each weighing up to 80 tons. So this is an absolute mammoth project. The actual construction process, though, remains kind of mysterious to this day. Certain studies have suggested a number of ways. It could have been a colossal earth ramp, or a system of spiral ramps that rose around the perimeter, or another popular opinion is the zigzag ramp, or this kind of narrow limestone ramp. And all of these you can see here in this slide depicted very simply. But it's likely in reality, that different combinations of techniques were used over the centuries and in different locations, but the Great Pyramid of Khufu, you can see here, was accompanied by 3 smaller pyramids for the pharaoh's immediate family, a mastaba for his mother, and to the east an orderly series of mastabas for his royal court. So this was a whole complex of funerary monuments, not just a standalone pyramid. And since death could come at any time, the pharaoh always needed an accessible burial chamber at the ready. So in actuality, 3 separate burial chambers were built during construction, each improving upon the last. Due to a shortage of oxygen, the first chamber was left behind, and a second chamber was built at a similar level as the entry. However, this was then abandoned for a third and final burial chamber positioned around 40 meters above the base, the highest burial chamber in a pyramid to date at this point. And this is what we call the king's chamber. This is the chamber that the pharaoh was eventually buried in. This very spacious granite room with this soaring corbelled ceiling located at the heart of the pyramid. And so, as you can imagine, Khufu put the secret entrance to the pyramid about 20 meters above the ground, just like it was on his father's Red Pyramid. So the burial ceremony used temporary earthen ramps to carry the body of the pharaoh up to reach the entrance, the elevated entrance of the pyramid. And then the funeral group would have accessed this chamber, this king's chamber, through an extension of a ramp leading to the grand gallery. And this hall had these very characteristic high corbelled ceilings. And so the king's chamber, finally, when you got to the final burial resting place of the pharaoh, contained this massive sarcophagus carved from a single piece of granite, so large that it was actually put in place first, and the rest of the chamber and top of the pyramid was built around it. And then above the room's flat ceiling, you can see these 5 stories of granite sit atop the king's chamber, preventing the pyramid from collapsing in on itself, as the absolute sheer amount of weight above the king's chamber needed this kind of primitive engineering insurance. So the top level had these kind of 2 slanting monoliths tilted up like a pitched roof to kind of. And so once again, the entire pyramid was encased with white limestone, which was polished with sand and stone until it gleamed. Most of it, though, has been pillaged, which is why you see kind of a rough sandstone appearance today on not just Khufu's pyramids, but really all the pyramids. And finally, a capstone would have been placed on the top, covered with electrum, so it glimmered like gold. Obviously, this has been pillaged too. Khufu's immediate successors then sponsored the other 2 large pyramids, and so Khafre built his just a few meters smaller in reverence to Khufu, while Menkaure made his half the size. Obviously, Khafre's is the best preserved, and his valley temple actually led to a T-shaped hypostyle hall. Only, mind you, priests were allowed to enter the causeway leading to the mortuary temple, abutting the pyramid, and here they would have laid down sacrifices for the sustenance of the royal body resting within the heart of the pyramid, since time immemorial, right? So for the ancient Egyptians, the pyramids at Gaza represented essentially a link, a very important link to the realm of the gods. Stripped of their reflective limestone casing and the capstones, though, the pyramids today seem a lot more earthbound. But when, they shone like luminous arrows emanating from the earth, they led the way to the spiritual realm. They led the way to the sun. And so, as you can imagine, these very important monuments had Egyptian Sphinx statues made to guard the entrances to important tombs and temples within this complex. Usually they were carved from granite, but this Great Sphinx in front of Khafre's pyramid, the very famous Great Sphinx, was carved from a ridge of outcropping bedrock. The very stones cut from the outcropping reveal the Sphinx was used to build the very valley temple in front of it you see here. The burden of building these final pyramids actually bankrupted the economy in the end, so the Old Kingdom regime steadily declined in the 22nd century BC as Egypt suffered environmental disasters. In this very precarious time, the Nile also refused to flood, which brought famine and, as you can imagine, political uprisings, the citizens believing the bad dynasty was causing the gods to spurn Egypt. So after more than a century of civil strife and anarchy, this new period known as the Middle Kingdom from around 2150 to 1750 BC took shape. And when these succeeding dynasties wrested back control, they felt obliged to downplay the role of the royal tomb and give more attention to temples, to focus on placating the gods so that the Nile behaves itself. So in this period, pharaoh and ancestor worship declined and god worship became much more popular. So the founder of the 11th dynasty, Mentuhotep, which you see here, was the one who reunited the two lands of Egypt and ruled it for 55 years. Now, Mentuhotep here broke the trend of mastabas and pyramids by commissioning a new type of funeral memorial, combining a temple to the sun god Ra with his rock-cut tomb. So essentially, this temple and mortuary shrine was to function a little bit like the pyramids. So like the pyramids, the funerary program, once the pharaoh died, was to begin like the pyramids at a valley temple near the Nile and then open on to this grand road about 35 meters wide, which you see here. On the right-hand side along this road were statues of the king seated and standing, wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt, while on the other side his statues were likewise wearing the red crown of Lower Egypt. And then, we go up the ramp to the first tier, this kind of colonnaded square platform carved directly from the cliff face. And this first pier would have been for pilgrims to essentially come and ask for favors. They could not really go directly into the sanctuary, but there would have originally been seated statues of the pharaoh within the colonnade, so people could go in and lay their offerings and ask their favors to, the pharaoh's spirit. So this was a temple to communicate with the pharaoh. And as you go further into this roofed sanctuary, you enter a space designed really only for the more wealthy visitors, aristocrats, priests, and governors. This housed a set of columns around 3 rows deep, surrounded by the walls of this kind of interior temple for the veneration of the local god Montu Ra, where Mentuhotep demonstrated this theological modesty, placing himself as a statue in service, kneeling down to the deity. And then the final room in the back here served as Mentuhotep's mortuary temple, carved directly into the cliff, accessed only by his mortuary cult priests and his immediate family. To service the tomb and feed his spirit, Mentuhotep would have installed a mortuary cult that meant giving them and their descendants mortuary lands in perpetuity to feed the statues of the pharaoh, right? And so Mentuhotep's real tomb, though, lay hidden very much deeper in the cliff, approached by this long underground tunnel, a descending passageway going down about 45 meters, and it led finally into this alabaster chapel, also accessed only by his immediate family, which led into this kind of blocked off burial chamber lined in pink granite. Unfortunately, it was all robbed in antiquity, so we don't know what it would have looked like, but very interestingly, there is evidence of a boat in this burial chamber. It's thought because the king's spirit would need to, travel to the afterlife and back to hear his petitioners. But the important thing to take away from all of this is the design here was the complete antithesis of the pyramids of Giza, right? Rather than a gigantic impenetrable mass that engaged, most of the kingdom's funds and labor, Mentuhotep simply cut his temple out of the live rock and offered these broad planted courts, colonnades, and interior halls as an inaccessible landscape geared to human scale and accommodating to pilgrims. The later rock-cut tomb, which you see next to the Temple of Hatshepsut, we're going to talk about in a later lecture, but you can see just the trend that he started. The trend he started caught on with just about every pharaoh after him in the Middle Kingdom. Now, the last significant architectural civilization at this time is the Indus Valley civilization, and I'm going to go over, the primary things we know about it. It's very mysterious, but this isn't going to be on the test. Nothing from this civilization is going to be on the test, so feel free to skip this part of the lecture if you're not interested, but if you are interested in this sort of period in architectural history, do stick around. This is just a bit of a freebie I've added on to the end of the lecture because your book goes over it, and so I wanted to review it because just to widen the scope of this class. So, essentially the Indus Valley civilization was located in the floodplain of the Indus and Sawarti rivers, and it was about, the best place in the world to have an ancient civilization because the rivers flooded very, very reliably twice a year, even more so than the Nile. And so it was the largest but most mysterious of all these early civilizations. And, archaeologists have actually discovered more than 1,500 towns and city-states, but their writing actually has yet to be decoded, which is why these Indus Valley people are shrouded in mystery even today. But here's what we know. They had amazing cities. The Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro cities are the best known, with these dense multi-story homes constructed out of these kind of uniformly sized fired bricks along these very perpendicular grid-lined streets. Most homes amazingly were connected to these kind of city-wide brick-lined drainage systems under the main streets that used gravity to carry waste and water out of the city to these big sewer ditches, something no civilization in the West at the time could boast of. But probably the most unique thing was that in many of their cities, the largest building was not a temple or a palace, but actually a public bath. In fact, no temples or palaces or public monuments of any kind are found in Indus Valley cities. These cities only contain houses, giant granaries for storing grain, and, of course, the largest public buildings, public baths. But the best thing by far about the Indus Valley people is we think they were almost entirely peaceful. Archaeologists have found very little evidence of warfare and almost no weapons, despite finding a very rich material culture. The evidence here suggests the existence of a kind of culture that encouraged a fairly equitable distribution of wealth. So, the question is, since there are no temples found in the Indus Valley civilization, really no architectural evidence of religion, is it possible that an ancient culture devoted so little attention to the supernatural? This is very hard to believe, as you can imagine when one considers the high degree of religion in later Indian cultures, the high, centrality of religion in later Indian cultures. But, the bath kind of offers a clue. So, we don't know what the bath was used for since we can't translate the writing of the Indus Valley civilization. But since later Indian culture, placed this huge emphasis on ritual purity using waters, some historians have kind of speculated that the bath may have been like a kind of giant baptismal pool for some kind of purifying ritual. But around 1800 BC, the Indus Valley civilization all but disappeared. The mystery of why this civilization disappeared to this day remains unsolved. It's one of the great conspiracy theories of history. The ruins of these cities show no damage caused by invasion, nor do the bodies, the skeletons found, show any evidence of violence. This civilization just kind of mysteriously faded into obscurity. But historians have three theories, so I'm not going to leave you in the dark here. The first is conquest. It's possible that people from the Indus Valley were completely overrun by people from the Caucasus due to their lack of weapons, maybe mostly peacefully, maybe violently, and we just haven't detected it in the archaeological record. But the majority of Indian and Pakistani genetics have their origin from the Caucasus, so this is a major possibility that just hasn't really been detected in the archaeology. But the second big theory is an earthquake. A massive earthquake could have changed up the river's systems so much that a lot of the tributaries dried up that these massive and small cities and villages depended on. Without adequate water supply for irrigation, the cities couldn't sustain themselves, and so people abandoned them and thought maybe going into the sort of Himalaya region to start new lives as pastoralists. And the third theory is climate change. The same climate change toward the end of the 3rd millennium BC that influenced the decline of Ur and Old Kingdom Egypt could have brought cooler weather and drought to the Indus Valley as well, affecting slowly but surely the ability for this region to sustain dense and high populations. Food shortages, you can imagine, must have forced a lot of people to move away from this region. But I think the best concluding remark of our little discussion of the Indus Valley civilization is that the cities of the Indus Valley kind of almost offer the possibility that humans might have lived in relative harmony for over a millennium without the help of religious or political monuments. If this was truly the case, it's absolutely remarkable and something that we've really not seen really anywhere else in large civilizations.